In 1970, Marvin Gaye delivered a completed album to Berry Gordy at Motown Records. Gordy listened to it. Then he told Marvin it was the worst thing he had ever delivered to the label. He refused to release it. That album became the best-selling record in Motown's entire history, and today, Hollywood is spending over $80 million to finally tell the story of how it got made. By the autumn of 1969, Marvin Gaye was in a place he had never been before. Tammy Terrell was still alive, but barely. The brain tumor that had claimed her 2 years earlier had reduced her to a shadow of the woman who had sung beside him on records that had defined the decade. She would die in March of 1970. Marvin already knew what was coming. The knowledge sat in him like a weight that made the studio feel impossible. His marriage to Anna Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister, was deteriorating. The personal and the professional were tangled in ways that produced a specific kind of pressure that had nowhere to go. He had withdrawn from recording. He had been watching the news, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, the deaths, the cities burning, with the growing feeling that the music he had been making was inadequate to what was happening in the world. That he had been singing love songs while something far larger was occurring, and that continuing to sing love songs was a kind of dishonesty he could no longer sustain. He did not yet know what he was going to do about it. He only knew that something had to change. The song that would eventually become the title track of the album did not come from Marvin. It came from a man named Obie Benson, a member of the Four Tops. In the summer of 1969, Benson had been in San Francisco during a period of civil unrest. He watched police move against a crowd of demonstrators on a street near the venue where his group was performing. He stood and watched something happen that he did not have language for immediately, but that he understood was important. The specific feeling of watching force applied to people who had done nothing to deserve it. He went back to his hotel and wrote the opening lines of what would become What's Going On. He worked on it with a songwriter named Al Cleveland. They finished something they believed was real, but they also believed they had written it for someone else. The Four Tops were not the right vessel for what they had made. It needed a different voice, a different kind of interior weight. They took it to Marvin. Marvin listened to it once, then he listened again. He went home and did not sleep. What he heard in that song was a door opening into the record he had not known how to make. A record that was adequate to what he had been seeing, to what he had been feeling about Tammy and about his marriage and about the country and about the specific burden of being a man who could make music while the world was burning and had not yet figured out what music owed to that burning world. He began recording in the spring of 1970. What he built over the following months was unlike anything Motown had produced. The label had a sound, a specific, polished, commercially precise sound that had made them the most successful black-owned record label in American history. It was a sound refined over a decade by some of the most gifted producers and musicians in the country. It worked. It sold. It was the architecture of the entire enterprise. Marvin's record did not sound like that. It was a suite, songs flowing into each other without breaks, a structure borrowed from jazz and classical music and gospel, designed to be heard as a single continuous statement rather than a collection of singles. It was politically explicit in ways Motown had never been. It was about Vietnam, about drugs in the community, about environmental destruction, about God and about doubt. It had a tenderness that was different from the tenderness of a love song. It was the tenderness of a man looking directly at suffering and refusing to turn away. He delivered the completed album to Berry Gordy in January of 1971. Gordy listened. Then he called Marvin and said he would not release it. He said it was the worst thing Marvin had ever given him, that it was uncommercial, that it was too political, that it would damage everything Motown had spent a decade building. Marvin said nothing for a moment. Then he told Gordy that if Motown did not release the album, he would never record for the label again. Not a single session, not one song. He would sit down, and that would be the end of it. Gordy did not believe him at first. He had heard ultimatums from artists before. Most were pressure tactics, most resolved. But something in Marvin's voice that day was different from a pressure tactic. It was the sound of a decision that had already been made, not announced, not threatened, simply stated. Gordy had been in the music business long enough to know the difference between a man who was still negotiating and a man who had made up his mind. Marvin had made up his mind. Gordy agreed to release it. What's Going On was released on May 21st, 1971. It sold 100,000 copies on its first day. It was the fastest-selling single in Motown's history. The album followed. It sold 2 million copies in its first year. It became the best-selling album Motown had ever released. It was reviewed in publications that had never previously covered a Marvin Gaye record, not as a soul album, but as a work of art, as a document, as the kind of thing you make when you understand that music has a responsibility to the world it comes from. Berry Gordy later said publicly that he had been wrong. He said it in multiple interviews across multiple years, without apparent embarrassment or qualification. He said, "Marvin was right. I was wrong. It's as simple as that." That is not a sentence Berry Gordy said often about anything. 50 years later, What's Going On is still being discussed in terms that feel inadequate to what it actually is. Rolling Stone magazine ranked it the #1 greatest album of all time. Not the greatest soul album, not the greatest album of its era, the greatest album of any genre, by any artist, in the entire history of recorded music. And Hollywood has decided that the story of how it was made deserves a film. Warner Brothers has committed over $80 million, the largest budget ever allocated for an African-American music biopic, to bring that story to the screen. Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine are producing. Alan Hughes will direct. The film is titled, What's Going On? The casting has been complicated in ways that feel appropriate for a story this complex. The role of Marvin Gaye is one of the most demanding roles imaginable. A man of extraordinary musical intelligence and an interior life that resisted easy summary even when he was alive to explain it. Terrence Howard, who was associated with a separate biopic project, stepped away from the role entirely. He explained his reasons plainly. The role required him to explore territory he was not prepared to commit to. No one has yet been announced for the Warner Brothers production. The film is still in development. The story it is trying to tell, of a man who chose silence over compromise, who said, "I would rather stop than release something that is not true," is still waiting for the right voice to carry it. Which feels, perhaps, exactly right. Marvin Gaye waited a long time before he made What's Going On. He refused to release it before it was finished. He refused to compromise it once it was done. He sat across from one of the most powerful men in American music and said, "This is what I made, and you will release it exactly as it is, or I am done." The film about that album is, in its own way, still in that same room, still insisting on finding what it needs to be before it becomes something less. Whether the film, when it finally arrives, will be adequate to the man and the record, that is a question no one can answer yet. What is already known is this: the story of a man who chose silence over a compromised version of his own truth, and who turned out to be right, is a story that has not stopped mattering since 1971. And it will not stop mattering when the cameras finally roll. Subscribe to Untold Soul Legends. Every week, we go behind the music, into the moments the history books almost missed. Hit the bell so you never miss a story, and share this with someone who loves soul music. These stories deserve to be heard.